In today's video I will show you how to paint Cities of Sigmar models to an almost display quality standard, but only in around 3 hours per model.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching PHLANSMINIATURES. I will be using the Freeguild Steelhelms for this little experiment, but you can paint any of the Cities of Sigmar models using the same method, although larger models might of course take longer to paint. Or maybe the other way around, because I always think something small will be easier to paint and the opposite turns out to be true. And these guys are really small, just look at them next to some of the Plague Marines I painted in my latest video. And by the way, I'm not going to base these guys now, since they're actually meant to be part of a larger diorama that I'm working on for a future video. So maybe subscribe to the channel if you want to see them making a heroic last stand against a terrifying foe. Alright, let's get some paint on these guys. I started by using a very dark reddish brown base coat to start from by priming the models black and then spraying them from above with a translucent red color. This step is quite subtle and you can skip it and go with a completely black primer as well. I just like to have some color on the models from the get-go. And when I paint multiple models at once, I like to start by base coating most of the elements before anything else. I don't know about you, but for me the most difficult part of any paint job is the selection of colors. Usually it takes me hours of deliberation before I even grab the brush, but once I select and block in the base coats, a huge boulder comes off my shoulder and I can just concentrate on painting. And by the way, if you want to have all the colors and steps I used in this video conveniently listed in a written form, you can head over to my Patreon to download the PDF guide for this project. In this case, the first color was quite simple, since I wanted to go for a nice vibrant red color for their shields and surcoats, so I started with a dark red color, burnt red from AK in my case. But you can use any dark reds like corn red from Citadel, for example. And to clarify, what I mean by base coating in this context is to paint around 90% of the surface with a couple of coats, leaving the original color in the darkest parts, which are usually at the bottom of whatever element I'm painting, so the part that is facing away from the light coming from above. The second color was a little more difficult. I wanted to paint some nice non-metallic metal steel on these ladies and gents, and figuring out the colors you want to use for non-metallic metals can be a bit tricky. And at this point you might be wondering why I'm painting dark Prussian blue over the armor and why these guys start to look like the American flag. Don't worry, it will make sense when we start doing the highlights. But ultimately I chose this color for 3 reasons. 1, I wanted them to be nice and vibrant, and for that I wanted to avoid having a lot of grey colors on them. 2, I painted their leader, the Freeguild Marshal, in a previous video and I used this color on him as well, so I wanted them to fit together. And 3, it will make more sense once you see the diorama these guys will be a part of. Alright, moving on. Next I painted all the stuff I wanted to be black, like their boots and weapons. On the box art they also have a ton of black decorations, stuff that is usually painted in true metallics. I guess the Games Workshop painting team also wanted to have an excuse to paint some non-metallic metal, so they left a lot of highlighted black parts on these models to make them look like really dark metal. Later I will change some of these things to gold because I felt the scheme lacked a little bit of color, but if you want to cut down on your painting time you can leave those black as well. All the leather bits like the vambraces, belts and the leather things going over their boots that I always forget the name of, they got a coat of whole red. As you can see, I'm using mostly AK interactive colors, but all of these can easily be swapped to Citadel paint if that is what you are using. Dumble brown or maybe Wordbearer's red could be a good replacement, for example. I thought I might give them a tactical advantage and paint their pants brown, which might be a good choice considering what they will face on the diorama. I used chocolate brown for this, which I felt was very appropriate. Then all the things that were supposed to be stained white in the end got a coat of silver grey. If you have been watching the channel lately, you are probably not surprised by this, but if you are new, let's just say that greys are better at painting whites than actual whites. All the faces and hands got a coat of saddle brown, which is basically the same color as Citadel Bugman's glow with a little shading over it. Finally, I took some Seraphim sepia wash and painted it over all the white areas that I painted with the silver grey. It will look messy as hell, but that is perfectly fine. We will fix that super easily at the very end of the paint job.
Alright, now we have all the base coats on the minis, it's time for the fun part, highlighting everything.
And I don't mean that in a sarcastic way, this is actually the most fun part of mini painting for me. Most of the thinking is done and the colors are in place, now I just have to bring them out with the highlights to see if I made the right choices. I started in the same order as the base coats, with the reds, and there is a reason for that. In my experience, painting reds is the messiest part of the paint job, and I tend to make more mistakes with reds than with anything else. So it is better to start with this, so you can cover those mistakes at a later stage, rather than messing up things that you had already painted before. At first I wanted to be consistent and use AK colors for this as well, but it just didn't work. AK is my favorite paint range, but the reds are just not the best in my experience. In the end, I ended up painting the reds and oranges with Chimera colors, but you can also use Mephiston Red, Evilson Scarlet and Trollslayer Orange from Citadel if that is what you prefer. And the method I was using will be the same across all the highlights, although it will be easier to pull off with colors that are not red. I painted all the edges and raised elements with the first red highlights and created scratchy volumetric highlights wherever I had some space, like on the panels covering their hips. Then I started adding colors containing orange, first Tulodyne red and then pure orange. As I went up in brightness, I started highlighting only the upward facing edges and making my volumetric highlights smaller inside the previous darker color. Finally, I mixed in some sunny skin tone into the orange and used this to give more definition to the reds by adding thinner edge highlights on the most prominent edges, outlining the panels parallel to the trim, and adding little scratches here and there. When I was done with this, I used some medium sand to base coat the trim of the red surcoats. Then I took a little dark sea blue, thinned it down to a glaze and dragged it from the middle of the red panels towards the shadow areas and on the shields towards the bottom. This smooths out some of the transitions, creates more contrast and adds an interesting new tone at the same time. I felt fancy, so I even added a brighter highlight on the trim with buff where it would catch more of the light. Finally, I used black to correct some of the mistakes around the red parts and added a little bit of black lining where I destroyed the separation between elements with the red. I left the white parts alone though, those will be easier to fix in the end.
Let's do the second difficult element and see how I managed to turn that blue on the armor panels into something that looks like steel.
I started by mixing in some white into the dark Prussian blue. Then I used this lighter blue to do exactly what I would do on any other material. Outlining all the edges, creating solid highlights where I had space and the panel was facing the light, and adding a lot of little scratches everywhere else. People sometimes think that non-metallic metal requires a completely different technique, but in reality you have to paint it very similarly to everything else. You just have to create more contrast, mostly by going up to pure white with your highlights. And ideally you should add some secondary lights and colors, which I will do with a little trick once I paint the main lights. Once I was done with this color, I realized that I won't have enough space on these tiny models and I needed to make bigger jumps in my highlights, so I switched to pale blue. I did the same thing as before, but on a much smaller area, making sure that I leave the previous colors visible. If you cover too much with this, you will lose the blue from the shadows and you will destroy the contrast on the model, making everything washed out and white. If that happens, you can simply glaze back the blues, but it is easier to be careful and not create extra work for ourselves. At this stage, it's also important to make the lines and scratches thinner than in the previous layers. In the base coating stage and the first highlight, I tend to use bigger brushes and I am less careful. But when I reach this stage, I usually switch to a finer brush and try to be more careful to draw thinner lines. The brighter the colors you're using, the more obvious and visible they will be in the end result, so the last highlights need to be the most precise. After the pale blue, I jump to ivory. This color is almost pure white with a little yellow in it, and that yellow will contrast nicely with the blues. That is why I'm not using a gray like silver gray here. With this, I drastically reduced the size of the highlights and only painted some of the most visible edges, and even those only partially. Once I was done with this, I used a little trick to make the metal look more like metal. I took a little burnt red, thinned it down to an extremely thin glaze, and then painted it in between the shadows and the midtones. Now this needs to be extremely thin and subtle, otherwise it will just look like a mistake you made on the metal. The reason I'm using red here is because all the red on the uniform should reflect on the metal, so a little red will look natural here. And at the same time, this will help me smooth out some of the transitions on the metal, saving me a couple of glazing steps in between the highlights. And now with that done, it's time to bust out the pure white and add some dots and some very thin edge highlights where I think the metal would be glinting the most. This might seem subtle and I am not sure how much it shows up on the footage, but in real life these pure white glinting spots are what really can sell the effect. And finally, here is another trick I have been using lately. I thinned down some laser yellow just like I did with the red glaze, and I glazed it right next to the ivory and white highlights in some places. This will make the whites even brighter and also add another subtle tone to the surface, but ideally it has to be so thin that looking at the models you shouldn't even notice the yellowish green tint without looking for it.
And with that, the most difficult part of the paint job is done. Now let's relax and do some easier stuff before painting what I usually try to put off as long as I can, the skin and the eyes.
That being said, let's do the gold. And this is actually quite easy since most of these elements are quite small, so a couple of edge highlights at the right spot and the right color should do the trick. I already had a dark reddish base coat from the priming, so all I needed was a relatively dark orange color, medium rust in my case, to cover most of it, leaving the darker colors only in the deep crevices. Then I jumped up to a greenish yellow with Sahara yellow, painting only the edges facing the light, reducing the size of my highlights inside the previous ones and adding scratches where there was space for them. Next I went to pale yellow, doing the same thing but making sure to make my highlights drastically smaller, leaving plenty of the oranges and the yellows visible. Then I used ice yellow to paint only the most prominent edges and to add tiny thin scratches. And finally I painted the usual final touches with pure white where I thought the metal should have a glint. A very important thing to notice is that since many of these gold elements are inside the other colors, I usually destroy the separation lines around them, which lowers the definition and readability of the models. So as I paint the models, I tend to have some black paint on my wet palette, and wherever I notice that the line is not clear between the elements, I just add a little watered down black to fix it. This will make the end result way better and more defined. Let's do something really easy next. I left quite a few black decorations on the model, and there were a couple of boots to paint as well. Once again, I used the same method as before, but only using 3 colors for the highlights, and in most places I only focused on some crisp edge highlights and a couple of scratches. For the first highlight I used dark grey, marking every single edge with it. Next I switched to neutral grey, and I used this only on the edges facing the light. Finally, I painted a couple of the most visible edges with medium grey. The leather bits were even easier. I did the first highlights with saddle brown, so the same color I used for base coating the skin, and then I jumped quite a bit higher with cork as my final highlight. Even if you only use 2 highlights, it's still possible to make it look like more if you modulate the brightness of the color you are using. You can make the color cover less and be more muted by applying less pressure with the brush, using more thinned down paint and not painting that many layers. Then, where you want to have brighter highlights, you simply do the opposite and make sure the color is fully opaque and bright there. Finally, to distinguish the leather bits from the rest a little more, I used the sepia wash over most of the leather except the brightest highlights. This is quite transparent and all the edge highlights and scratches will still be visible, but a bit darker and a slightly different color. Plus, it also adds a little glossiness to the surface. The pants and the undergarments are not very prominent on these guys, so I finished them with a single highlight of green-brown. A few of them have a couple of things made of wood, like the little shrine thing the priest is holding and the shaft of some of the weapons and the banner. I highlighted all of them with mud brown and added a couple of random textures with scratches. Then I added another highlight with mud brown plus some white mixed in. And when I was done with the highlights, I washed some Gragak Sewer contrast paint over the whole surface to integrate everything together. Before I did the skin, I had one more thing to do. I needed to apply some transfers inside the white fields on the banner and the shields. I cut out all the pieces I needed and put them into a little water. The Seraphim sepia already left a nice glossy finish on the surface, so now I just had to add a little moisture on top and then place the transfers over that. I waited until it dried and the transfer wasn't moving anymore, and then added a couple of layers of matte varnish over the whole thing to make it look like the transfer is actually part of the surface and to get rid of the glossiness of the wash.
Time for my favorite part. I have painted a lot of minis since I started the hobby, but somehow I always end up covering faces with helmets. It's almost like I'm doing it on purpose. But these guys have open helmets, so there is no escape this time. And if you do something, do it well, so here we go.
The original skin was painted with saddle brown, so now I mixed in about 50% brown rose and used it to paint almost everything except the deepest shadows. It is important that skin is supposed to be smooth, so my usual method of scratches everywhere doesn't really work. We need to do homogeneous highlights here and smooth out the transitions with a little glazing. Next I used pure brown rose to do the same thing, but reducing the area I covered. I concentrated this on the planes of the skin facing the light coming from above. I made sure that I covered the nose, the cheeks, the lips and the chin. Then I mixed in about 50% sunny skin tone into the brown rose and reduced the area of the highlights even further. The final highlights I did with pure sunny skin tone. But I wasn't entirely finished yet. I thinned down some magenta to a super thin glaze and used it to paint it into the shadows. Similarly to how we did it on the steel armor with the red, this has to be extremely subtle and should barely be visible unless you look for it, but it adds a lot to making the skin look more natural. And to finish everything off, I used tiny amounts of laser yellow and painted it into the midtones next to the highest highlights. The eyes were a delight to paint as always on these tiny models. The method is easy enough in principle. You paint the whole eye socket black, then you paint the inside with ivory so the black acts as a rim all around. Then you make a little dot with black in the middle of the ivory, making sure that it touches the upper and the lower rim. It is easy in principle, but the execution can be a little tricky, so be prepared to mess it up a couple of times and start from scratch if needed. And don't even try this without a good pair of magnifying glasses. Once I was more or less happy with the eyes, the only thing left to do was to finish the white fields, and fortunately that is super easy. I simply took some ice yellow and did a thick edge highlight all around the fields to hide the red smudges I made in the beginning. I also added a couple of scratches, mostly coming in from the sides. Finally, I used ivory to make thinner edge highlights and some tiny scratches. And with that, after around 15 hours for the 5 models, my Sigmarite infantry was done and the end result looks like this. I think they are quite cool as they are, but just wait until you see them on the diorama in a future video.
In the meantime, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe. And if you want to have a written version of this guide with all the colors, a ton of pictures and all the explanations, then head over to my Patreon. Thanks a lot for watching and for your support. See you in the next one.